Bell hadn't rung yet, but we're going to get started. Okay, bell rang. It's time for us to get started. Great to see everybody here, the first Sunday of the new year. The class that we were going to have starting tonight, that has been changed. That's going to be tomorrow night. And Glenda, your presence is required. Never mind, that's a joke. That was a joke. Speaking of the class, we will, as soon as we get everybody, after the evening service is over and everybody gets rearranged, we'll start the class that we're going to have on first aid. And might suggest that you bring a notebook if you want to make notes, because we're not going to be doing any handouts and we'll be moving right on along. But at the same time, if you have questions or we need to stop and pause and do a little explaining, we'll do that too. What class is it? It's a first aid class, but it's a level 2. It's a trauma class, not your Band-Aid and ointment for burn. As soon as evening service is over and we can get everything settled down. Starts tonight. It'll probably go 8 weeks. My portion will take about 4. And then Jeremy Day will do his. So need to keep everybody in mind that it's been on the sick list. Some updates on, Sister Fuller. She's congested and along with everything else, cold. Or Brother Charles Price, over the night they have had to increase his morphine, so he's in pretty bad shape right now. Brother Terry is like he's feeling pretty good, but he says he's still kind of iffy on the nausea portion. So let's keep all those in our prayers. Anybody else that we need to put on the sick list? Brother Terry, if you would lead us in a prayer before we begin class.
Willing to come to this earth and die in our place. Father, for that sacrifice, Him being sinless, He suffered so much for us. Father, we are thankful that we can offer prayer on behalf of those that we're concerned. Brother Charles Price, we pray for that family as time draws near. Thankful, Father, that we are not meant to live here forever, but to dwell with Thee eternally. Father, we have seen improvement in some, and we offer our thanks to Thee. Father, for others that are continuing to face these difficulties, we still pray that pain and sickness might be alleviated, the problem be done away with. Father, we're mindful of Fuller stages. Father, so many that are still dealing with problems of physical nature. Father, we are also thankful to ask the churches area that can shine as a light and be salt. Pray our influence might always be good. In the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.
Amen. How is Doug? They're not here today. He's been back and forth to the emergency room a time or two, but he's He had an echocardiogram Friday, supposed to have no more next week when they get the results back, and according to Beverly, they think it might be the pericardial, something dealing with the sac around the heart. So, all right. Acts chapter 23. We'll pick up about verse 16, but I think we're at a point where I'm going to pause and bring in a little bit of secular history, because personally I think we're at that juncture where it's important. Paul has been on 3 missionary journeys to this point, and when he returned from his 3rd journey, and again, I'm not dogmatic about exact years, but let's just say we're at the year 59, give or take a year either way, and he is in Jerusalem, and he has been put into protective custody, I'm going to say, because the Jewish leadership was after him on what was going on. But where we need to pause is when Paul first started his missionary journeys. Claudius was a little bit nuts in certain areas, but he left the Jews and the Christians alone, more or less. But if you remember, it was about 52 AD when he ran the Jews out of Rome. So he really didn't have a fondness for the Jews, but he was a little paranoid. Now, in 54, Claudius died or was killed, depending on which source you look at. And they believe, if you would draw a consensus of it, Agrippina, his wife, poisoned him. So she's the one that killed him. So then she could marry, well, let me back up a second. She had him killed, was his adopted son, which was Agrippina's son, and she wanted him to be on the throne, the emperor, instead of Claudius' son by his other wife before he married Agrippina. When you get into Roman hierarchy this way, there is a big mess that goes on. But anyway, Nero was 17 years old when he became the emperor in 54 AD. So for the past 5 or so years, Nero has been the emperor. But if you notice, everything going along, the Romans are still protecting the Christians. There is not any government animosity against them at this point. It is in about 4 or 5 years, depending on our dating, but in 64 AD is when 3/4 of Rome burned, and the people didn't like Nero, so they accused Nero of setting the fire so he could build his golden house over that portion. However, history shows us that he was about 40 miles away when that happened. So he didn't do it personally. Now, he could have had it done, but anyway, the people accused him. But then in turn, to divert attention, he accused the Christians. And that is when Christian persecution by the state or by the government started happening. So we're in that transitional phase, because if this is 59 AD with Paul in Jerusalem, 59 is when Nero had his mother, Agrippina, killed. He tried to do it by putting her in a boat that had a hole in it and was going to sink, and that didn't work. She swam to shore. So he sent soldiers in to kill her. So again, when you get back into these families, there is a lot of mischief and evil going on. But that puts us at the point now where, as I say, in 59 or 60 here, where Paul is in Jerusalem and he's under house arrest or house guard or protective custody. The government is still not after them. It is still the Jews that are after the Christians. Questions or comments on that so far? Correct. Fiddling while he was accused of fiddling while Rome burned, but and that's because, well, one reason that the people didn't like him was he didn't care that much about being an emperor. He liked poetry and music, and he even took I guess you could call it a sabbatical from governing to going around and touring in plays and such. So the people had a real disdain for him. And if you've been keeping count, as I said, he assumed the throne when he was 17, and that was in 54, and now he dies in 68. So that puts him a pretty young fellow when he dies or commits suicide. So, but that catches us up on a little secular history getting to this point. And questions or comments? So, starting in verse 16 then. When Paul's sister heard of their lying in wait, he went and entered into the castle and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions unto him and said, Bring this young man unto the chief captain, for he hath certain things to tell him. The reason I personally believe that it was what I call protective custody is that the people coming to see Paul could come and go freely. Paul could have visitors. He wasn't closed off, and he could even get somebody like the centurion. He called the centurion and had him take his nephew to the chief of the band to have a conversation. Now, let's pause here for a minute and talk about chief of the band, centurion. If we go back and look at chief of the band is the equivalent of a cohort, and a cohort was how many people in the Roman army. It varied through the years, but just say approximately 1,000. It was a sixth of their battalion, so to speak. So if they have a chief of the band here at the castle or here at the barracks, the temple guard, that meant that there was 1,000 Roman soldiers there to keep the peace. Because here he called the centurion. The centurion is over how many people? 100. So there would have been 10 centurions there, and they would have rotated their time as being on guard or being in charge of the guard and all. So here he called a centurion to take the nephew into the chief of the band so he could talk to him. Verse 18, when he took him in and brought him to the chief captain and said, Paul, the prisoner, called me and prayed me to bring this young man unto thee, who has something to say unto thee. Now notice he didn't run him off. The chief captain then took him by the hand and went with him aside privately and asked him, What is this that thou hast to tell me? To me, he was doing this in an informal setting. How many, Bobby, you've been in the military, as some of us. How many times does somebody who outranks you or is in the position of authority will come up and apparently just gently take you by the hand and lead you over to have a private conversation? Doesn't happen often. When I was in Arkansas, when I met my colonel for the first time, he walked in my office and I did everything you're supposed to as meeting an officer for the first time. And then he said, well, we need to go eat. You know any places in town, walking distance? I said, well, there's a place just down the road here. As we walked out the door, he just threw his arm around me and said, Larry, I've been hearing a lot of good things about you. We got along great from that point on. Very informal. But like you say, it doesn't happen often. But to me, in this setting, this is what's taking place. Paul, nephew, come on over and what do you got to tell me? He bought lunch. Surprising, but he bought lunch. Back to verse 20 then. And he said, the Jews have agreed to desire thee that thou wouldest bring down Paul tomorrow into the council, as though they would inquire somewhat of him more perfectly. Just mean need more information. But do not thou yield unto them, for thou lie in wait for him of them more than 40 men, which have bound themselves with an oath that they will neither eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now are they ready, looking for a promise from thee. So the nephew warns him. And again, if we go back to a stranger talking to somebody, what are the odds of him taking that threat seriously? So, but apparently he takes it very seriously. Because in verse 22 it says, the chief captain then let the young man depart and charged him and said, don't tell anybody. I'm paraphrasing. It says, see thou tell no man that thou hast showed me these things. So he's keeping the secret so everybody doesn't know that he knows. And look what happens next. Verse 23. He called unto him 2 centurions. How many people does a centurion in charge of? So now he calls 2 to him. And he says, make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea. You think he's taking the threat seriously? Because the nephew had told him there was 40 that was out to get him. And now he's telling 2 centurions to make ready 200 people to guard Paul. Definitely, he is on the spot. If he loses control of him, if Paul gets killed, he's the one that's going to be held responsible. But look what he does next. Horsemen, 70. 70 is how many? 60 plus 10, 70 horsemen. He doesn't stop there. And spearmen, 200. He has just assembled a small army of about 500 people, 470 if you get down to nits, but an army of almost 500 people to protect Paul as they move him from the city of Jerusalem to Caesarea. Now, Caesarea is about 60 miles from Jerusalem. So they're going to move him 60 miles, and they're going to take him to Caesarea because that's where the governor of the region is, Felix, that we'll get to in just a short order here. But he also said do it at the third night, or the third hour of the night, which means about 9 o'clock. So they're going to do it, and they're going to, I guess the phrase would be, steal him away in the dark, move him in the dark so that they have more of a chance of getting him out, because most people back in those days, well, most people, even when I was a very young youngster, we was indoors by dark. So they're going to get him out of the city with a guard of almost 500 to take care of him. Yes, sir. What Brother Terry said was those 40 men wouldn't have stood a chance. They wouldn't have stood a chance against the 200, because the 200 that's initially set to guard would have been carrying what was referred to as short swords. The Romans carried the long sword, the broadsword, and the short sword, and they did most of the fighting with the short sword, which was about like yay. Correct. At this point, they were highly trained, ready for war, could have handled any situation. Uh,
Can we call this God's providence? Expect Paul. Did that mistake because of
I suppose we could, because the guards saved him, and and then they were going to make sure he stayed safe.
So that before we perhaps saw all the men taking Paul out, he looked at it, I just sort of think I'm seeing all that going. We will make you suffer. They said, wow, they will eat Paul. Never mind.
Yeah, if they stuck to their vow, we know 40 of them died shortly. Okay.
The story of Elias, and Elijah say there's more for us than against us.
That's
Not
great.
there's more men for us, but God has a way of.
God has a way of. Yeah. Now, that's just the 200 with the short swords would have been enough to take care of it. But Brother Henderson, you had mentioned the army at that time. What would 70 horsemen have been doing? What was 70 horsemen? They generally was in lead of the charge, and the horses were trained as fighting horses. I don't know how much you know about that, but any of you ever heard of Lipizzaner stallions? If you ever get a chance to see the Lipizzaner stallions, go watch, because they trained them for war like this. And the Roman horses, if somebody had been charging them, the horse was trained to rear up and take the first blow to protect the rider. In addition to that, the spearmen, what would the spearmen have been? They would have been the ones that were hurling the spears and throwing the javelins and things of that nature. Yeah, they were the long range fighters. So you can see that the army that they put together to protect Paul, they were serious about his protection. Adequate? Okay. Okay. Brother Jeremy just said they put out the Romans put out the statement that we're in charge, and very true. Not only that, verse 24, they provided them beasts, meaning Paul and the ones accompanying him, they were going to get to ride. More than likely, it was donkeys. And the reason I say that is in that time frame, they had horses, donkeys, and camels. But they had more donkeys than anything else, and the horses were reserved for the army. So I personally think it might have been donkey, but whatever, it was a beast that they put Paul on and those with him to bring him safe into Felix, the governor. As Brother Clonch had said earlier, this Roman chief captain, he didn't want anything to happen to Paul because it would have been his neck if Paul had been killed. He wanted to get him to the governor and get that situation off his back, and he wanted to do it with great surety. Yes.
I also have the opinion that when they moved to Mennonite with large force, I think the Romans realized that because the Jews could be powder keg when it came to things concerning the temple, you had 40 men that made a vow that they would not eat or drink until this man was dead. It would not take very much for them to incite a larger, much larger group to come and help them to ensure that this man died. And while, yes, if you look at the professional shoulder of the Roman Empire, they were very proficient. However, if you look at the sheer number of Jews that were in Jerusalem, that force of Romans that were escorting this man out in the middle of the night could have been overtaken by the sheer number of Jews that could have been risen just to fight this cause. So yeah, I think Rome had a small army as only one man out of Jerusalem. I also think that the Jews had a large number of young men who were able to be swayed one way or the other as far as their convictions.
Well, and I agree with that because we've already seen where it doesn't take but one person to stir up a mob. And also, historically, Felix had already been in trouble with both Claudius and Nero for allowing some disturbances in the province that he ruled. So all of that is very valid. Yes, sir.
Would it be military action against Babylon took place during the daytime, not night, usually saying so. They're using that as an opportunity to go. Nighttime comes to stop Babylon, with something going to be more. These people are moving by night.
Moving by night. And also, he sent half his force out with him. So for whatever reason, whether it be that they were afraid that the Jews would rise up in rebellion, or they just wanted to make a show of force, they wanted to make sure that Paul was secure and healthy when he got to Felix. Well, brother Cox said that by them moving them at night, that the other people was waiting until the next day, so it sort of took them by surprise, and which also is a valid point because he didn't wait. They got him together and got him out of the city. And then also in verse 25, this chief captain doesn't just send Paul with this group. He writes a letter to go to Felix. And in verse 26 is the first time that we find out what the chief captain's name is. Claudius Lysias, unto the most excellent governor, Felix, sendeth greetings. Now, I've already mentioned that Felix had been in a little trouble with Nero and even Claudius before that for letting things get out of hand. And Felix was not exactly a symbol of greatness. He had been a slave that had been freed, but that really didn't have much to do with his attitude. His attitude was he was more of a dictator and more of a me person, and he didn't treat people very well. But here, as a good military person, the chief captain heaps praises on him. Verse 27 through 30 is his letter, and we'll read the whole thing and then go back and make a comment or two. It said, this man was taken of the Jews and should have been killed of them. Then came I, an army, and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. And when I would have known the cause whereof they accused him, I brought him forth into their council, whom I perceived to be accused of questions of their law, but to have nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or of bonds. And when it was told me how that the Jews laid wait for the man, I sent straightway to thee and gave commandment to his accusers, also to say before thee what they had against him. Farewell. So he lays it all out. He writes a letter to the governor, lays it out that Paul would have been killed had they not intervened. Paul was a Roman citizen, even though he was a Jew, he was a Roman citizen. So I guess technically the Romans were bound to protect him. Well, Brother Klontz just said that he didn't get all the facts exactly straight. But again, this is a chief captain sending a letter to the governor. And then as now, people sending letters, they always want to put themselves in the best light. So is he shading the truth a little bit here? Because he was called to go to the rescue. He didn't just happen to see what was going on and intervene. And he had been told that Paul was a Roman. So, I'm sorry? Right. When he was about to beat him, then they took. So, but then he was informed that they had laid wait, which is true. And so then he wanted to get him straight way to him and then bid him farewell. Verse 31, then the soldiers, as it was commanded them, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris, and that is approximately 35 miles from Jerusalem, sort of in the halfway point. Now, if there are foot soldiers, horses we know can move faster than men, but we've got about 400 men on foot. How fast do they move? Romans could move pretty fast because they was used to it. On forced marches, if you go back to your history, how many miles did Patton's army march in 3 days and go immediately into battle? About 100 miles in 3 days. So on a forced march, meaning you just stop and take a drink of water and rest for a minute and move on, you can make some pretty good ground. So here they'd made 35 miles and then they stopped to take a break. And then on the morrow, they left the horsemen to go with him and return to the castle. So part of them was going to leave and go back to Jerusalem, and then the rest of them was going to take him on to Caesarea. Why would they split up here? The threat was not there because any logical army that's moving something, they're going to have a rear guard and they're going to see that they're not being followed or not being, nobody sneaking up on them. So the threat is now, it's not imminent anymore that they can divide their forces and send some back to the castle. And then it says, who, when they came to Caesarea and delivered the epistle to the governor, presented Paul also before him. So now Paul is at Caesarea. He's at the governor's place. Paul's standing in front of the governor of Caesarea. Governor reads the letter, but then he asks Paul what province he was, meaning where are you from? The letter's already told me you're a Roman, but where are you from? Why was that important? Jurisdiction.
Can I pass this book along, or do I have to do it?
There you go, because if you recall everything that in the up to this point that we've gone along, that how they, if they don't have to deal with it, they shuffle it to the next person. So he is making sure that it's got to fall on him. So he asked Paul his exact location. Where were you born? Where are you from? And when he understood that he was from Cilicia, I got to deal with it. You're mine. Verse 35 says, I will hear thee, said he. But then he put it off and said, when thine accusers also come. And he commanded him to be kept in Herod's judgment hall or jail. Again, I think more protective than anything else, because the letter to him had said that the Jews really didn't have any reason to kill him, and that he had got him out of that situation and then passed him on along to him. And it was going to be up to him to then to decide between the Jews and Paul. Yes, sir.
At the beginning of the chapter, the chief priest of Ananias tried to keep Paul quiet, and the Sadducees or whatever, they were the ones who were the biggest insiders of keeping Paul down, right? That's correct.
That is correct, and Ananias was of the Sadducee sect. So that
So at the beginning, they were trying to keep, just like this with Jesus, they were trying to do it privilege. But the more they incite the thing, the more people got involved, and God got an opportunity to put his hand on the situation. And you can look at the Romans and all of the armies and stuff, they accumulated, but that was God.
right,
That was God's will.
right.
And God used the same weapon of the enemy to incite a good army to protect Paul.
Same way we can look back and get the example from the Old Testament, how many times he used different nations to do his bidding or what needed to be done to get their attention. Anything else on chapter 23? I find the first part of chapter 24 most interesting also. It says, after 5 days, Ananias the high priest descended with the elders and with a certain orator named Tertullus, who informed the governor against Paul. Start with this orator, Tertullus. If we want to put it in today's lingo, he's a lawyer. I'm sorry? A slick-tongued lawyer. Okay, we can go with that. But the Jews, it was not uncommon for them to do this. They would get a Roman lawyer, somebody that knew Roman law, to stand in and speak for them on certain situations, and that's what's happening here. It wasn't just somebody that could speak well. It was somebody with knowledge of their laws because he was going to inform the governor against Paul. So he was going to be the one bringing the, I guess you could say he was the prosecuting attorney against Paul. Verse 2 and 3 go together. It says, and when he was called forth, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying, seeing that by thee we enjoy great quietness, and that very worthy deeds are done unto this nation by thy providence, we accept it always and in all places, most noble Felix, with all thankfulness. What did he just do? Brother Cox said he lied like a dog. He is addressing the governor, Felix, laying all kind of platitudes on him, how great and wonderful he is, to try to gain a little favor in his sight. And the Jews hated the Romans. Then in verse 4, he comes back with, notwithstanding that I not further tedious unto thee, I pray thee that thou wouldest hear us of thy clemency a few words. In other words, he leaked all these platitudes on him about how great and wonderful he is, how merciful he is. Now, bear with me just a little longer while I present this case, is in essence what he was saying here. And in verse 5, he starts out, for we have found this man a pestilent fellow, a mover of sedition among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. If you kept count, he accused him of 4 things. A pestilent fellow, meaning what? Drop most of that word, and if you just use the first 4 letters, it's what? He's a pest. Then he's a mover. What would be a mover? Somebody that shakes and bakes and gets people stirred up. The agitator. And what's he the agitator of? Sedition. What is sedition? Against what they thought was the norm. He was bringing up issues against the Jews. And then he's the ringleader. Was Paul the ringleader? Be careful how you answer this. Was Paul the ringleader? Okay, the reason I said be careful how you answer this is even though Paul was doing exactly what Paul was supposed to do, preaching the gospel, writing approximately half the book of the New Testament, getting the church started, the actual ringleader of the movement was Christ, right? However, anytime there is somebody that is taking the banner and moving forward with it, they're going to be looked at and accused of being this. If you go back into our recent, well, not so recent history, a couple of 100 years, Protestant Reformation, well, let's go back a little farther than that. Who was the ringleader in the 1500s of the movement? Martin Luther, because he started it all, didn't he? By his 95 Theses. So anytime throughout history, somebody takes the forefront or the lead. And if you recall, at one time, when Paul first started on his first missionary journey, it started out as Barnabas and Paul, but then it wound up to be what? Paul was the one that they were looking at. So here they're accusing him of just being the ringleader of the whole group. Well, they could have wanted to put it on him because he's a Roman, but they already looking at him as a traitor because he was a Pharisee of Pharisees, and now he's a Christian. So he is, in the eyes of the Jews, he is a traitor. So I think that might be more why they want to put it on him than him being Roman. However, with them arguing to the governor, to a Roman governor, that could have had a little bit to do with it. But the next verse says, who hath also gone about to profane the temple. What had he done to profane the temple? Somebody go back to Acts 21. Brother Joel, you fast on Bible verses. Acts 21, verses 28 and 29.
Crying out, men of Israel, tell, this is a man that teacheth all men everywhere against the people, and the law and his place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple, and polluted the place.
So now we go all the way back to when they saw a Greek in the temple. Whether or not he was a proselyte Jew or not, it's not said, but Paul profaned the temple by bringing in an unauthorized person to the temple. See, what's happening here is this orator, this lawyer, and courts today do the same thing. They just throw everything they can up against the wall to see what sticks. And they're just really piling it on. And then it says, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. I think that's where Brother Cox made the comment that he just telling a lie. Could they honestly say that they were going to judge him according to their law? What had they already done to him? Why had the Roman guard had to come in and take him away? They had already condemned him, and they had already started beating on him when the Romans came in to save him. So there was no trial. Sorry our bell rang. Brother Clements can pick up here Wednesday night, but I really appreciate your attention and all the comments.